Okay, well, hello and welcome, everyone. This is Tadaima 2023. This presentation is yes, no, qualify, refuse to answer, or don't register. Did you know these were all some of the responses that were on the loyalty questionnaire? So a comparative loyalty questionnaire from Jerom, presented by our own James Okamura. And I'll just tell you a little bit about James. He's from Boyle Heights, east of downtown Los Angeles. He's Sansei and a native Angelino. He said he is a beneficiary of early Asian American studies programs at Pasadena City College and UCLA. He maintained a lifelong interest in the Nikkei experience and Japanese culture, and that exposure and interest led him to investigate his own family history in the context of the Nikkei experience in the United States, which subsequently stimulated his interest in learning more about his family's and relatives' experiences in Japan. I think you're going to find a lot of interesting connections and ties with your own family history. He has volunteered for Denjo, and he's now a docent for the Tule Lake Pilgrimage and has written a short piece for Discover Nikkei called A Day of Remembrance at Janum. And now he says, after working in information systems for nearly 30 years, he's retired to continue pursuit of his lifelong interests in ceramics, family history, and gardening. And I am so delighted to welcome him here today. Some of you may have seen his presentation at the Jerome Rower Pilgrimage, but tonight he has even more details to share with us. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, James.
Thanks very much, Julie. Appreciate it. Thanks to all of you for attending this presentation here today. I know some of you I saw and met at the Jerome Rower Pilgrimage earlier this year. Some of the material will be the same, but there'll be some new stuff here as well. So anyway, this is, like Julie had mentioned, the presentation. Let me just go into a little bit of an agenda here. What I'm going to do is read through a piece called Paper Loyalty. It's a story that I wrote, true story about my father. I'll tell you in a little bit about that. But after that, and for those of you who went to the Jerome Rower presentation, this is what I read there. I'll also go through the loyalty questionnaire and give you some background, some information about how the form came about, what happened, some of the results, how people responded, and then I'm going to go into a little bit of the aftermath of what happened to the Okamura family number 30-SP-108. We'll start off here first with paper loyalty. So this piece is about how the U.S. government's 1943 loyalty questionnaire affected my father and his family during the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans. It's written employing the form and techniques of dramatic or narrative nonfiction. The actual events are true. It's presented using the Japanese street storytelling technique of kamishibai, or paper drama. The photographs and images are a combination of historical photographs, publications, maps, artwork, and family photos matched to the events as closely as possible. An advisory is warranted. This piece contains vulgar language. It uses outdated terminology used at the time to describe people of all backgrounds, ethnicities, and abilities. The topic of suicide is mentioned. Actual names of people and families are used. This usage is not intended to offend anybody. Its purpose is to relate the story as accurately as possible. Those uncomfortable with this advisory may not want to view this presentation. As the endless inmate queue snaked towards the Block 36 mess hall, now commandeered as the prison administration's centralized registration office, a tense and somber mood laid heavily over the line of hundreds of delinquents who failed so far to officially register their national allegiance. No one spoke casually. Only moments of short, quiet conversations, grumbling and sighs interrupted the uncomfortable silence. By last Friday, over 1,000 inmates, nearly 20% of those required to do so, still hadn't registered their loyalty. During the past weekend, some people beat up Dr. Thomas Yatabe of the Japanese American Citizens League and Reverend John Yamazaki of St. Mary's Japanese Mission. Few openly said what many thought. They may have been stool pigeons or inu, informants for the prison administration. Simmering pressures in Jerome had boiled over. Osamu Okamura, whose nickname was Johnny, stood patiently in line with his father, Seisuke, and his sister Toyo for their turn to seal their fate before U.S. government officials. The hours crawled all Wednesday towards the looming 5 p.m. deadline as the inmates crept towards the mess hall entrance. Meanwhile, Johnny's mother Tome and his oldest sister Masako stayed home in their Block 4 barracks quarters. Masako couldn't stand in line for hours indefinitely. The brain fever she had suffered since childhood left her crippled with a rigidly paralyzed right arm and speech impediment. Stress triggered her periodic seizures. Tome and Masako couldn't stand in line to register their national allegiance that day, even if they wanted to. Since this whole mess began, Johnny wasn't alone in his thinking. Like most other inmates, including his parents and sisters, Johnny knew the US government had violated their civil rights as US citizens. And now in return, the government was demanding their loyalty despite its blatantly abusive behavior. Bakayaro fools. Long before their imprisonment, from well over a decade earlier, Johnny began each school day standing with his teacher and classmates, faced the American flag with its 13 stripes and 48 stars, and with their right hands over their hearts recited in unison, "I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation with liberty and justice for all." Johnny cared little for sports and athletics. Airplanes and ships drew his interest, but Johnny's father, Seisuke, felt judo instilled good character and made him practice it from the age of 5. Johnny attended weekly practice sessions and learned throwing techniques and physical training at the Moneta Judo Dojo. Head instructor Toshitaka Yamauchi also instilled the Kodokan Judo principles of Seiryoku Zenyo and Jita Kyoe, were the use of human efforts and mutual prosperity, which promoted the advancement of the community and society at large. Yamauchi Sensei encouraged Johnny and his fellow students to embody the judo spirit by becoming worthy people, to do good, and commit to doing their best, to maintain interests in literature and martial arts, and to always be aware there's only one journey of life. But beyond the classroom and dojo, the world fell far short of the ideals Johnny's teachers and sensei taught their students. California laws prohibited his immigrant Issei parents, Seisuke and Tome, from ever owning the land they farmed for decades. Unlike Negroes, Mexicans, Indians, and other races, the US government considered Orientals, like immigrant Japanese Issei, as aliens ineligible to citizenship and prevented them from becoming naturalized US citizens. US laws enacted before Johnny was even born prevented Japanese like his parents from immigrating to this country. White society believed them unassimilable and an economic threat with a low standard of living. Despite all the prejudice, Johnny, born in Los Angeles like his 3 sisters, was a US citizen. Even if the Okamura family's immigrant parents couldn't become US citizens, the children were by birth and legally bestowed their civil rights. The Bill of Rights and US Constitution guaranteed it, and they not only believed it, but counted on it. Johnny was 16 years old that December morning in 1941 when the tsunami effects of the East Asia War crossed the Pacific and slammed American shores. The nativist backlash against the Japanese community erupted swiftly. Los Angeles South Bay newspapers reported demands that all Japs be rounded up and shipped off. Radio programming crackled and spewed the decades-old anti-Jap vitriol of unbridled mob hate mentality. The FBI arrested and detained Johnny's family relatives, Soichiro Hamano and Fusakichi Takeuchi, without charges after December 7th. Their respective wives, Hiroko and Matsu, had to comfort themselves and their children for days until they eventually learned of their husband's imprisonment at the Department of Justice's Tuna Canyon Detention Center. By March 24th, the Western Defense Command announced 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. curfews and 5-mile travel restrictions for alien Germans, alien Italians, and all persons of Japanese ancestry. Finally, the rumors came true. On the last Monday in March, the 30th, while walking home from school, Johnny saw the posters conspicuously nailed to telephone poles, fences, and walls. Civilian Exclusion Order Number 2 proclaimed that all persons of Japanese ancestry be excluded on or before noon, Sunday, April 5th. A responsible member of each family was instructed to report to their wartime civilian control station at the Employment Service Office during the next 2 days. After reporting as instructed, Johnny's father, Seisuke, and sister Toyo returned to their Lomita home with the news. The family had to get rid of or store all their belongings, settle all their affairs, pack as instructed, only beddings and linens, toilet articles, extra clothing, essential personal effects, limited to that which can be carried by the individual or family group. And early on Easter Sunday morning, report for temporary detention. To comply with the exclusion orders, Johnny's parents lost their agricultural business. They sold their farm equipment and their cauliflower crop and cabbage crop to Joe De La Torre for an agreed upon $1,700. Joe took out a Farm Security Administration loan to fund the purchase, but after the War Relocation Authority took over handling the agreement, Joe said he could only pay half that amount. Instead of arranging financial terms for Joe to pay the fully agreed upon amount, the WRA made Johnny's family accept half. Liberty and justice for all was not what Johnny witnessed. In 5 days, the local Japanese community was laid to waste and evicted courtesy of the U.S. Fourth Army without firing a single shot. By mid-August, just over 4 months later, the Western Defense Command executed the last of its 108 civilian exclusion orders and completed its part in the nation's ethnic eradication program by dutifully rounding up every person of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. Johnny's high school education stalled mid-semester of his 10th grade spring term. Detention dashed his childhood dreams of pursuing aeronautical or maritime studies. Having to leave their family dogs tormented him. Seeing their German shepherd follow them for a mile as they drove off before he finally gave up particularly broke his sister Toyo's heart. She loved animals. Circumstances soured further during those 4 months of detention at the Santa Anita racetrack. Johnny and his family's situation reeked as badly as the stench of horse shit and piss in the stall his family was forced to occupy after the equines were removed. Johnny's family wasn't alone in their distress. The Wartime Civilian Control Administration detained over 18,000 other people at Santa Anita alone. Ironically, 3 weeks after the Okamura family entered the Santa Anita Detention Center, the Selective Service forced Johnny's father, Seisuke, to register for the draft. He was 59 years old, and like all military-age eligible male detainees, the Selective Service classified him as 4C, alien enemy. Once the U.S. Army completed its roundup and detention of all West Coast people of Japanese ancestry, the War Relocation Authority began movements of detainees by the trainload, shifting them by the hundreds to remote prisons for indefinite incarceration. For the Santa Anita detainees, the exodus started in late August 1942. Like all detainees, the WRA scattered the Okamura family relatives and friends across the country. The Hamanos were sent to Heart Mountain, Wyoming. The Takeuchis and some Oishi relatives were shipped off to Rower, Arkansas. The Yamauchis and other Oishi relatives were exiled to Gila River, Arizona. The Okunos were dispatched to Amachi, Colorado. The U.S. government's forced diaspora was in full swing. Johnny's family received their orders and packed for their next destination. Solemnly, early one cool, damp mid-October morning, the Okamura family boarded a Union Pacific train headed to Jerom, Arkansas. By Halloween, Santa Anita, emptied of its last detainee residents, became a ghost town. All West Coast Japanese disappeared, and only the phantom yurei of the 31 detainees who died there remained. After 5 days of constantly sitting in crowded agony, riding a miserably slow, antiquated train, the Okamura family disembarked to a hastily built prison in Jerom, Arkansas. Prison administrators assigned the Okamura family their standard crude barracks one-room quarters located amidst the Mississippi River Bayou. During that autumn of 1942, the Jerom inmates worked together to stabilize and make the best of their depressing, ramshackle situation. Johnny took a job as a lumberjack and his father, Seisuke, as a yardman, clearing nearby forests and cutting firewood for cooking and heat. However, the difficult and dangerous work of felling trees and digging up stumps proved too much for the 17-year-old boy and 60-year-old elderly man. Toyo took a job as a block mother, responsible for preparing and distributing sparse baby formula rations for newborns amongst the roughly 250 Block 4 residents. Tome managed her daughter Masuko's seizures with little medical assistance. 1943 began no better than the year before. In mid-January, Johnny heard from others that a section foreman and 4 Negro workers found a severed head and body by the railroad tracks. Apparently, a Mr. Yoshida crawled beyond the barbed wire fence during the night, laid his neck on the track rails before an oncoming train, and committed suicide. The prison official bulletin confirmed the tragedy. Mr. Yoshida was not alone. Johnny and other inmates felt and shared his feelings of hopelessness and despair. Late in January 1943, the War Department announced its plans to create a segregated Nisei combat unit. The Selective Service, which classified Nisei males a year earlier as 4C, alien enemy, now reclassified them as 1A, available for military service. Johnny, now 17, technically not of military service age, would be eligible to serve by summer. The War Relocation Authority fully supported the plan and placed its facilities at the War Department's disposal to advance its own inmate parole program. The agencies jointly created screening questionnaires with common questions to identify allegedly loyal citizen inductees and allegedly loyal citizen parolees. The War Department announced that no individual will be inducted if doubt exists to his loyalty. On February 5th, the Okamura family read the prison official bulletin informing Jerom inmates that the agencies required everyone 17 years and older to complete the registration questionnaire, with the exception that no registration will be made of persons who have applied for repatriation. Johnny saw the prison's special bulletin published the next day, announcing meetings primarily for male citizens between 17 and 38 years old. Army representatives would deliver a message particularly prepared for the male citizens in this age group at meetings scheduled for Monday. Lieutenant Eugene Seiler, head of the Army team at Jerom, announced, for the information of the Issei, the series of meetings will be repeated in Japanese as soon as translations arrive. The bulletin also reiterated registration will be center-wide, excepting those who have requested repatriation. The Monday meeting, scheduled for Johnny's Block 4, was held in neighboring Block 3's mess hall. Immediately after lunch, at 1 p.m., in true military manner, the Army team cleared the mess hall and delivered their uniform statement proclaiming their purpose and position. Then they simply read a series of pre-selected questions with predetermined answers, not fielding inquiries from any members of its meeting audiences. They informed the inmates present, male citizens will fill a second form, and the question of loyalty will be answered in the presence of only one representative of the War Department in a room provided for that purpose. The following day, February 9th, teams of 10 registrars began processing inmates in each mess hall of blocks 1, 2, and 3. Confusion, consternation, and anger ensued when inmates first read questions 27 and 28. How are Issei men and women to respond when asked if they are willing to volunteer or serve in the Army Nurse Corps or the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps? Would all Issei ineligible to become U.S. citizens become stateless by forswearing any allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor? The same question insulted Nisei inmates who always considered themselves loyal Americans and never had any allegiance to Japan's emperor. The WRA form itself, titled Application for Leave Clearance, instilled fear inmates would be dumped on short notice into hostile American communities and subject to local violence and murder. Johnny and his family heard about the questions from their Block 3 neighbors as news quickly spread like wildfire throughout the prison. The Army and Prison Administration delayed registering the first 3 blocks to the following Monday, supposedly due to a shortage of forms, but the inmates knew better. Why would there be a shortage of forms on the very first day of the registration process? Johnny and his family didn't bother to register the next day, on February 10th, when their Block 4 was scheduled to sign up. On February 12th, prison officials finally posted Japanese translations of the questionnaires at the mess halls. Lieutenant Seiler, head of the Army team, carefully clarified that the combat duty question was asking for a statement of loyalty and did not obligate a citizen to volunteer for the combat team. Prison Director Paul Taylor declared that any group who wanted questions answered could hold a meeting and request persons qualified to answer them. The WRA changed their form after inmates at several of the other 9 prisons reacted similarly to those at Jerom. They changed the form title to Information and altered question 28 to ask if they would abide by the laws of the United States and to take no action which would in any way interfere with the war effort of the United States. but the changes only applied to immigrant Ise inmates. Ise inmates, including women and minors, were still required to complete the original application for leave clearance form with its unchanged objectionable questions asking about their willingness to serve in the military and their allegiance to the Japanese emperor. The block-by-block registration ended on George Washington's birthday, February 22nd. Registrars now centralized their office in the Block 36 mess hall to register any delinquents. By February 26, roughly 2,500 of the required 5,800 inmates still had not completed their registration forms. To achieve their numeric goals by the March 3rd deadline, prison officials pressured inmates to register and warned delinquents would be reported to Washington. The inmates already knew they were in a prison. Could it get much worse? To resolve their dilemma, inmates discussed amongst themselves their possible options, the consequences of their choices, and how to respond to problematic questions 27 and 28. Some who responded yes, yes, didn't understand why others replied no, no, or even could even consider such an answer. Some who replied no, no couldn't see how on earth others could reply yes, yes. Others wanted to qualify their answers for their own unique situations. Upset with their poor treatment at the hands of the US government, some activists like Reverend Shizuo Kai and George Kuratomi advocated their positions supporting Japan. Some wanted to repatriate to Japan and were assaulted. Others, like Dr. Thomas Yatabe and Reverend John Yamazaki, who advocated US loyalty, were also assaulted. The divisive effect of registering national allegiance corroded the inmate community. For 17-year-old Johnny, like many others, family relationships strongly influenced his registration decision. What would his parents do once they were released? At 60, Seisuke and Tomie were too old to start farming again. Toyo handled all the family's legal and tax matters. She needed Johnny's support to keep the family together. Crippled Masako couldn't be left alone. If Johnny were drafted, would he be sent into a Pacific combat zone where his third sister, Mie, might be? She went to Japan before the war, got married, and stayed there. Might Johnny be stuck in a position forced to kill his judo instructor, Yamauchi Sensei, who got trapped while traveling to Japan when the war started? If Johnny and his sisters registered differently than their parents, might Seisuke and Tomie be deported with the children stuck in the US? The US government's loyalty questionnaire caused families to argue and fight between and amongst themselves about their choices. For weeks, you could hear arguments through apartment partitions and walls. Some families refused to speak to each other and were torn apart. Others stayed quiet. Like all inmates, the Okamura family discussed their reasoning and considered their options. The March 3rd registration deadline came and went. Nothing happened. The Okamura family didn't register, nor did over 1,000 of the total 5,800 inmates required to do so. On March 5th, the Army team and prison officials extended the registration's absolute deadline to 5 p.m. Wednesday, March 10th. Prison Director Taylor threatened delinquents with 90-day jail sentences for non-compliance. Johnny and his family decided to complete their registration on the final March 10th deadline date. On that cold and damp Wednesday, Johnny, Seisuke, and Toyo joined the other inmates standing in the seemingly endless Block 36 mess hall registration line, while Tomie stayed home to care for Masako. Hours later, finally inside the mess hall, Johnny observed the registration tables filling with floor space. Opposite each inmate sat a registrar interviewer. Japanese language interpreters sat at some tables. One by one, inmates took turns to register. At last, it was the Okamura family's turn. As the Army team promised, the registrar determined Johnny was 17 and directed him to a separate room to answer his Selective Service Form DSS 304A in private and in the presence of an Army representative. Feeling threatened and frustrated, Johnny answered the first few basic questions: name, birth date, birthplace, current address, sex, height, weight, and marital status. Subsequent questions probed intrusively, so Johnny read them before answering. They asked for the names, addresses, occupations, and citizenship of relatives in Japan and the US. Dates and destinations of any foreign travel, religious affiliation, membership in or contributions to any organizations or clubs, foreign language ability, sports and hobbies, Personal references, magazine or newspapers regularly read or subscribed to. Johnny felt his hot anger building. That was none of the government's business. Finally, the two gut-punching questions. Question 27, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? Question 28, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States of America from any or all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization? Indignant, Johnny's blood boiled with contempt. Emotions from repressed memories resurfaced of the discrimination he and others who looked like him suffered before their detention. The US government crushed his personal dreams and obliterated his community. There were never charges filed for his imprisonment, no due process as guaranteed by the US Constitution. His civil rights were as meaningless as his US citizenship. No liberty and justice for all nothing but a big farce. Johnny refused to answer any more questions. He stood up and declared, I have forfeited my citizenship and will repatriate to Japan. The Army representative recorded his renunciation and expatriation intent, marked all unanswered questions as refused to answer, and dated the form. The registrar forced Johnny to sign the form, and he was shown the door. Outside the mess hall, Johnny met his waiting father and sister. They too had responded similarly to their own registrations. Prison administrators said those requesting repatriation were exempt from registering, but they still made Johnny and his family register. Another broken promise, another lie. In the cold and damp winter air, Johnny, Seisuke, and Toyo joined the other inmates, carefully walking across the slippery, muddy streets, and returned to Tomei and Moscow, waiting them in their Block 4 barracks. What I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the loyalty questionnaire, give you some factual information about this. So the first thing I'm going to do is discuss, give you a little bit of background, go into some of the origins and development of the forms and how this was actually executed. Okay, so this is the background timeline. Mass incarceration set the backdrop for the following events, which led to the creation of two forms generally known as the loyalty questionnaire. In early January 1942, the U.S. War Department reclassified all Japanese American Selective Service registrants as 4C enemy aliens. 6 months later in September, the War Relocation Authority started working on a resettlement policy. By the end of 1942, only 884 had resettled outside its incarceration centers. The War Department and the War Relocation Authority concluded they both share the same dilemma and collaborated to determine Japanese Americans' national allegiance. In late 1943, the War Department announced its plans to create an all-Japanese American combat unit. The Selective Service reclassified Nisei males 18 years and older as 1A available for military service. It's a little bit about the forms here. Three forms used before and shortly after the mass exclusion began contain questions common with the loyalty questionnaires. In 1940, the U.S. Congress established the Selective Service by enacting the Selective Training and Service Act. They created DSS Form 304, Aliens Personal History and Statement. This form contains standard personal background questions, but asked for controversial information regarding relatives, organizational affiliations, and political beliefs. In the spring of 1942, the National Japanese American Citizens League mandated all of its members sign and notarize its form NJCLOA1, the Oath of Allegiance. This form contained language that the member would defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and forswear and repudiate any other allegiance. During the same period, the National JACL also compelled its local chapters to survey Kibe in their areas and provide guideline survey questions for its form NJACL KS1 Kibe survey. This non-governmental form contained particularly controversial questions about travel to Japan, education, religion, military service, hobbies, organizational memberships, citizenship status, and detailed family member and personal asset information. To screen Nisei recruits at all 10 incarceration centers, the Selective Service modified its original Form 304 and created Form 304A, Statement of United States Citizen of Japanese Ancestry. This form covered similar topics as the original Forms 304, but also contained controversial questions and statements oddly like the National JCL's Oath of Allegiance and Kibe survey. The WRA adapted and renamed the Selective Services Form 304A to create its own Form WRA 126, Application for Leave Clearance, to use in its own release and resettlement program. And a little bit into the execution of how this was administered to the incarcerees. Less than 2 weeks after the War Department released its plan to create an all-Japanese American combat unit, the War Department and WRA began rolling out their respective loyalty questionnaires across all 10 incarceration centers. Detailed planning and execution were left up to the individual camp director and each U.S. Army team captain sent to recruit Nisei soldiers. This resulted in varying registration processes and procedures. Incarceree responses to these forms correspondingly varied at each camp. Nisei males 17 and older were asked the controversial questions 27 and 28 on both their Selective Service and WRA forms. Question 28 contained wording similar to the National JCL's Oath of Allegiance, but now included an objectionable reference to the Japanese Emperor. Some Nisei interpreted this as a trick question admitting loyalty to the Emperor of Japan. Nisei females and older Nisei females 17 and older, and Nisei were also asked the controversial questions 27 and 28 on their WRA forms. The WRA rolled out the original question 28 with the same reference to the Japanese Emperor. Nisei women also found the presumed Emperor allegiance offensive. The Issei objected that they would become stateless if they answered yes to question 28. U.S. immigration law had forbidden them from becoming naturalized U.S. citizens. The WRA realized its question 28 mistake and provided guidelines to camp directors for rewording the question and removed the Japanese Emperor reference. Additionally, for all incarcerated Japanese Americans presented with the WRA application, the title of the application for leave clearance raised questions about the process. Respondents asked about the program, but received no answers as details had not been fully developed. The question 28 rewording varied, again, because camp directors were left to handle the details. A little bit of, so I just talked about the background, a little bit about the form, the execution, varied by the individual camps. Let me go through a little bit about the results. So this is the results, and this is the pie chart part of the presentation. This is from the WRA's own documents. They documented that just under 78,000 incarcerees were 17 years or older in early 1942, and therefore required to complete the loyalty questionnaires. Overall, with respect to question 8, and that's what these pie charts are, 87% responded yes, just under 7% responded no, roughly 4% didn't bother to register, their no-shows. The remaining 2% qualified their answers, did not answer, or the responses are not known. Results by incarceration center, again, varied widely because each camp director and Army captain handled the detailed planning and execution differently. Again, this pie chart here is just the total of all 10 incarceration centers. So let's take a look at the results by center and talk a little bit about that. At Minidoka, the camp administrators involved Issei leaders in 5 days of intensive preparation and procedural meetings before the Army teams arrived. Camp authorities published propaganda stressing the future of the Japanese and the U.S. depended upon how incarcerees responded to both the questionnaire and to Army recruiting. Issei leaders echoed that message. Amachi followed a similar process where Issei leaders and camp administrators delivered a consistent message to incarcerees. These two camps, as you can see, the yeses are very high. Again, this is question 28, almost 100% in both cases, 99 plus and 98 plus. At Poston, the U.S. Army completed the recruitment process for Nisei males before the WRA began registering Nisei females and Issei. The Army team could not answer many of the Nisei males' questions during mass informational meetings. Those questions included things like, what were the reasons some of us were given 4C status? Why were Nisei draftees kicked out of the army after December 7th? Why can't Nisei soldiers visit this camp? Why are Nisei not accepted in the Navy? Why the Jim Crow decision? And that's related to the segregated combat unit. Inadequate responses to these questions set the stage for the Poston administration's subsequent difficulties with its own leave clearance registration. At Gila River, the camp director threatened those outspoken against registration with prison sentences for violating the Espionage Act. The camp administration turned over names of the alleged subversives to the FBI. The FBI then arrested these Issei and Kibe leaders and imprisoned them at the Lordsburg, New Mexico DOJ camp and at the Moab, Utah Citizen Isolation Center. At Manzanar, a high turnover of camp directors and repeated mismanagement preceded registration. The JACL collaborated with camp administrators, advocated for the Nisei military draft, and pushed to replace Issei and Kibe block managers with a Nisei community council. Those actions led to unrest, which resulted in the shooting deaths of 2 and shooting injuries of 9 by military police. Those events, plus the subsequent martial law instituted in December 1942, created an unfavorable environment for the Manzanar incarcerees required to complete loyalty questionnaires less than 2 months later. At Jerom, early in the registration process, incarcerees were informed that those repatriating were exempt from registration. Additionally, the camp director failed to inform incarcerees that completing the loyalty questionnaires were compulsory until nearly a month after registration had started. After the camp director made incarcerees aware of the requirement, they petitioned for repatriation. The camp director further confused the situation by signing a statement stating those requesting repatriation would not be arrested unless directed by Washington, D.C., and even then, only after being given a 24-hour notice. Tule Lake incarcerees first heard about the WRA relief clearance registration only through the camp newspaper and less than a week before they would be asked to complete the form. The camp newspaper also stated individuals repatriating were exempt from registration. The administration deferred answering any further questions pending the assistant director's return from Washington, D.C., but the assistant director deflected answering any questions to the Army team arriving on February 6th. The JACL filled the information void, advocating favorable compliance. The Army team arrived 3 days late on the 9th with registration starting the next day. Without clear answers to their questions, incarcerees chose not to register. The camp administration threatened Espionage Act violation penalties for noncompliance. 34 Block 42 youths demanded the right to request repatriation and refused to register. Military police arrested them at bayoneted gunpoint and held them at the Modoc County Jail. During registration, 100 Kibe were removed to the nearby CCC camp under WRA and Army supervision. Some were sent to the Moab, Utah Citizen Isolation Center. Others returned to Tule Lake. How the camp directors and Army captains handled registration at each incarceration center heavily influenced the center's registration results. What I'm going to walk you through next will be the aftermath of what happened to the Okamura family. So, because of its high registration noncompliance, the WRA designated Tule Lake as a high security segregation center to consolidate so-called disloyals and troublemakers from all 9 other incarceration centers. In September 1943, Johnny with his sisters and parents joined the 12,000 other disloyals transferred to and segregated at Tule Lake. In the fall of 1943, Seisuke served as the Block 10 co-manager of the Daihyo Shakai, or representative body, working to improve the poor conditions at Tule Lake. He later joined the Hoshidan Japanese Patriotic Society to help prepare his family for re/expatriation to Japan. Never having been to Japan, Johnny's and Toyo's respective Hokokudan and Joshidan memberships helped prepare them and other Nisei for expatriation. Director mismanagement, administration food theft, accidental death, unrest, martial law, strikes, and a murder committed by an Army guard led to the radicalization of the Japanese patriotic societies. The FBI arrested and imprisoned 75 Hoshidan leaders in December 1944 with the goal of eliminating the organization. Seisuke was elected as a replacement Hoshidan vice chairman to fill the void left by the imprisoned leadership. The FBI subsequently arrested Seisuke in January 1945 and imprisoned him with 170 others at the Santa Fe, New Mexico Department of Justice internment camp. Less than 1 month later, the FBI arrested 650 Hokokudan members, including Johnny, and sent them to the Fort Lincoln DOJ internment camp in Bismarck, North Dakota. The DOJ imprisoned them next to German merchant marine sailors who were trapped in East Coast ports when the US declared war on Germany. With family members imprisoned in different locations and written communications censored by authorities, the Okamura family secretly communicated by passing handwritten notes sewn in repaired clothing and gifts of hand-woven zori sandals sent to each other. The notes confirmed the plan to re/expatriate to Japan. Shortly after Christmas 1942, over 4 months after Japan's surrender to the Allied powers, Johnny from Bismarck and Seisuke from Santa Fe separately boarded a U.S. military transport ship anchored in Portland, Oregon for deportation. 3 days later, Tome, Masako, and Toyo boarded separately from Tule Lake. 4,270 other deportees joined the Okamura family and boarded the USS General Gordon headed for Japan. Several deportation ships from the US similarly crossed the Pacific after the war. Johnny had a third sister, Mie, born in Gardena, California, who was a dual US-Japanese citizen. Seisuke and Tome sent her to Japan before the war in the 1930s. She got married in Japan and stayed there. Mie lived on Palau in the Western Pacific area of Micronesia and returned to the Japanese mainland before heavy fighting in the Pacific began. She joined the roughly 10,000 Nisei and US-Japanese dual citizen strandees in Japan. Having renounced their US citizen, all the Okamura family members in the US were now Japanese nationals, except Johnny. Because he was born after the 1924 Japanese Exclusion Act, his parents did not register his birth, Before he was born, before the 1924 Japanese Exclusion Act, and his parents didn't register his birth with the Japanese consulate, Johnny only had US citizenship. And now, having renounced his US citizenship, or then renouncing his US citizenship, Johnny became a Native American alien, effectively stateless. 3 days after departing Portland, Oregon, during their voyage across the North Pacific in the dead of winter, the Okamura family reunited on deck during scheduled visiting hours. Men were quartered separately from women and children. Males and females were allowed limited visits on deck, weather permitting. 2 weeks after they set sail, the Okamura family disembarked at Uraga Port near Yokohama. They joined the 6 to 7 million Japanese nationals repatriating from China, Manchuria, Korea, Southeast Asia, the Pacific, and the Soviet Union to a destroyed and starving nation. Upon arrival at Uraga Port in January 1946, U.S. occupation forces immediately recognized the Nisei renunciants and their families' bilingual abilities and heavily recruited them for translation work. The Okamura family returned to their ancestral hometown in Miyakan. The local elementary and middle school employed Seisuke as an administrator. Toyo worked for the U.S. Foreign Service with the Occupation Forces Housing Department, located in the Daein-Chofu area of Tokyo. In 1946, U.S. District Court Judge Louis E. Goodman ruled in the Abo versus Clark case challenging the Nisei U.S. citizenship renunciations. Wayne Collins, Tex Nakamura, and the Tule Lake Defense Committee filed a class action suit years earlier against U.S. Attorney General Tom Clark seeking to cancel the renunciations. Judge Goodman ruled in favor of the renunciants, canceling their renunciations, and concluded the Nisei signed them under duress. The Attorney General's office appealed to a higher court. That higher court upheld the renunciation cancellations for minors, but returned the adult Nisei cases back to the lower court to try the 4,000 plus renunciants individually. As a side note, today's Zoom host, Julie Abo, is a descendant of Tadayasu Abo, the first plaintiff listed in the Abo versus Clark case. His wife, Yukiko, was also a plaintiff in the case. Both her grandparents were represented by Wayne Collins in the Tule Lake Defense Committee. In February 1952, Johnny enlisted in the U.S. Air Force and was stationed at Haneda Air Force Base in Tokyo. He married Yoshiko Yanagihara, and together they started a family. In September of that same year, Johnny received a letter from Attorney Collins informing him that the U.S. District Court canceled his renunciation. Johnny was again a U.S. citizen. The U.S. Armed Forces honorably discharged Johnny from active service in February 1956. His parents and sisters decided to remain in Japan. Johnny, his wife, and 2 children boarded the troop transport USS General Breckinridge, anchored in Yokohama, and set sail for the U.S. Under their 2-week midwinter North Pacific crossing, landed the family in the port of San Francisco. Johnny arrived home in California. Johnny settled in Southern California with his family. He completed aeronautical studies at Glendale City College and began working in the airline industry. After the Abo versus Clark appeal, the Department of Justice reached agreement with Wayne Collins and the Tule Lake Defense Committee to address the remaining adult Nisei renunciation cases. The agreement created a process where renunciants would file individual affidavits requesting renunciation cancellations. DOJ attorneys would then review the affidavits and either approve or deny the cancellation requests. Toyo filed her affidavit in 1957 requesting her renunciation cancellation. Shortly thereafter, the DOJ approved her request, restoring the U.S. portion of her dual citizenship. The process for reviewing the renunciation cancellations for 5,589 Nisei continued for 23 years. The ongoing effort spanned 5 U.S. presidential administrations from Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy to Johnson, and the 8 U.S. attorney generals serving under those administrations. In the end, 4,978 Nisei had their renunciations canceled. A side note, Tadaima will be hosting a YouTube session with filmmaker Sharon Yamato about her latest film on attorney Wayne Collins. And that session is scheduled for next Wednesday, October 25th at 6 p.m. Pacific time. The Okamura family citizenships were finally restored to their previous state before the outbreak of World War II. The Department of Justice considered Masako mentally incapable of renouncing due to her disabilities and determined she maintained her dual U.S. citizenship throughout the ordeal. Mie, also a dual citizen, lived outside the U.S. during the war and never renounced her U.S. citizenship. In the early 1960s, Seisuke died. In 1968, the last of the renunciant cases was closed. Masako and Tome died in the 1970s and 1980s. Toyo and Mie returned to the U.S. and moved to the Tamai Towers in Denver, Colorado's downtown Sakura Square district in the late 1980s. Family, friends, and distant relatives had resettled nearby in Colorado after the war and the release from the incarceration centers. President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which apologized to Japanese Americans and Native Alaskans and provided reparations for their illegal incarceration. Johnny received his letter of apology signed by President George Bush in 1990. Toyo received hers shortly thereafter. Ironically, in 1997, the Japanese government demanded Toyo choose between her Japanese or U.S. citizenship. At 81 years old, she was forced to make the binary decision and choose one of the 2 nationalities bestowed upon since her birth. The Japanese government's 1985 nationality law changed and eliminated dual citizenship. Toyo chose to renounce her Japanese citizenship and remain a U.S. citizen. Mie was also presented with the same decision. While her response is unknown, it is likely she too renounced her U.S. citizenship. Mie died in 2007. Toyo died in 2010. Johnny died in 2021.
Yeah, so if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I'm going to put the link for the screening of the film that's in Los Angeles, Sharon Yamato's film about Wayne Collins. Wow, James, thank you so much. I mean, so much information.
Yeah, information overload.
But really well presented, with the graphics. It really helps a lot. Like Alyssa said, it really helps to have those visuals. And you did so much research. It's truly incredible. Well, while people are thinking about their questions, one question I had for you, James, is I heard your fascinating stories. Well, tell us a little bit about your journey, about the origin of this journey of learning your family history.
Oh yeah, I guess I've always been interested in family history for some time, and I guess the origins of this story, or whatever, paper loyalty specifically, was part of research into my family history. And I've been, like I said, I've been interested in family history since I was a kid. Um, at a certain point in adulthood, I thought I'd write the full-on family history, war and peace sort of thing. And then I kind of came to the conclusion that it was too complex to write, too long, and I don't think anybody would read it anyway. So what I started to do, and I've been doing for a few years now, is focusing on short stories, very focused stories. So like in this particular case, around the loyalty questionnaires, there's other stuff that I've written about, like Mochitsuki and a few other things. None of this stuff is public, publicized. The only one is the piece that I have over on Discover Nikkei. But at any rate, that's kind of how it started. And then as I started writing this story, I think I started to discover there was a lot more information that I needed to find out to kind of fill out the story. And that's where I really started getting into the loyalty questionnaire piece of it. A lot of it is also from discussions that I had with my aunt Toyo and my father, Osama Johnny. So I kind of knew where they were all coming from, and some of the family tales and that sort of stuff. So I tried to incorporate some of that into the story as well. But essentially, short answer is, it was basically the origins of the story. The impetus to the story was all this was family history, research in family history.
So yeah, along those lines, then, did your family talk a lot about this history, or when you were young, or it seems like you were encouraged in some ways to learn more about it?
I certainly wasn't discouraged, but it's kind of like I guess, if you start talking about things like citizenship renunciation and the 1924, Japanese Exclusion Act and all that sort, how are you going to explain that to like a 12-year-old kid? It's just like, you really can't. So I would ask questions, and my father and my aunt, my relatives, would answer as best as I could, given sort of my age. And it wasn't really until later as an adult that things started to clear up. And then I started to learn more and ask more pointed questions, more information would come up. But my relatives were always, if I would ask the questions, they'd be more than happy to share it. That's how it came out.
Oh, that's great. And um, so I know that you actually studied in Japan, right? Did you have an opportunity at that time to do some research? I lived in Japan, and I'm just kicking myself that I didn't do any research. I did talk with some family, but I
Yeah,
didn't.
I was when I was at UCLA, I was an exchange student at the International Christian University in Mitaka, Japan, and through the UC Education Abroad program. So I did my equivalent of a junior year abroad, but in my case, my university plan was like the 7-year plan. I didn't do it in 4, so it's a little later. Um, yeah, bits and pieces I got. It wasn't a lot of heavy research, but what I inevitably during the course of conversation, things would start popping up, and I'd ask a few questions. I'd go over and see my aunts or uncles, and so I learned about other things, and in particular about the transnational aspects of family members who were either like my aunt, who was in Palau, or on my mom's side, one of her sisters and her husband was in Seoul, South Korea, during the Japanese occupation there. One of her other sister's husband's family was in Indonesia, I believe it was, in that part of the world, pre-war, before all the hostilities happened everywhere. So So yeah, specific to the incarceration, bits and pieces, and then kind of expanded it beyond that as well.
Well, I think you should write a book, James. I
Yeah,
mean, I think that's so
thanks.
incredible, though, that you were able to talk to your relatives in Japan, and I think that's pretty amazing. And how did that impact you, do you think? I mean, because you grew up in a Japanese American community, but how do you think being able to talk with your relatives in Japan, how did that affect you and your sense of identity as a Japanese American, as Nikkei, as yeah.
Yeah, it was. Well, I guess I started going to Japan, right after high school. Actually, the first time I went, I was 9 years old. I had my 10th birthday there, and it was summer vacation. But I hadn't gone subsequent to that until I was, I guess, 18 years old. Um, Loved it. Went just every summer. I'd try to go over there if I could. Um, and at about that same time, because this is the mid 70s. This is going to sound corny, but Alex Haley's Roots came out, and the television series came out. And the television series was also being broadcast worldwide, and it was being broadcast in Japan at the time. And so shortly thereafter was the time that I started going to Japan as a 18, 19, 20-year-old. And so my relatives always thought, oh yeah, you're coming to find your roots. So they were very accepting of that. And in a very true way, it was me finding my own identity, my own roots. And so I guess that kind of had a bit of an impact as well.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. Oh, I hope you do write a book, James.
No, I don't. No, no, thanks. This is enough.
Yeah, or maybe somebody in your family will. But no, I can't tell you, but it's so, I heard your story before, but hearing it this time too, I found it really satisfying to hear those pieces, the transnational pieces, because those are pieces in my family that I don't know completely. But I guess it's my job now to make sure I can find out more. But I can't talk to the people because the people are gone.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Everybody now is. I have I had a lot of uncles and aunts and all that sort of stuff. They're all gone. Most of my cousins are
yeah.
too. So I've got like, I guess, three out of the what 8 or 10 or so that were alive at the time. So anyway.
That's a gift that you had. Yeah. Hey, so Julie in the audience there, would you like to ask your question? Go ahead and unmute and
Oh,
ask your
hi,
question.
James. Nice to see you.
Hi.
I just was writing that I was just amazed. I agree with Julie that you should write a book, but really the impetus behind that is not so much to give you work, but are there any plans for, besides today, sharing the information and the research that you've that you've done with the community in any way?
No current plans. This was kind of I did a portion of this presentation at the Jerom, rower one that you saw, and kind of updated this a little bit. There's probably some additional updates. Maybe I'll do another presentation, but there currently aren't any other real plans to do this. I guess it'll be recorded though, so if somebody wants to wants to see it again, they can. Hopefully that answered your question, Julie.
Yes, well, we're very grateful. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, at the Jerom pilgrimage, I thought that was really creative how you did the Kamishibai story, which you did the paper story. It's a great to hear it in another way,
Yeah.
Any more questions from the audience? Oh, thank you, Alyssa.
No,
She's great. She's with the Japanese American Museum of Oregon. So
okay.
that's great.
Yeah, I'm a
share them. And yeah, that's great. We have this recording.
Yeah.
Also,
Alyssa, say hello to John Asaki. He's a distant relative.
Will do if I run into him.
Yeah, okay.
anybody else have questions about the research process, or are any of you doing this kind of research?
Oh, One thing that I want to make a couple of plugs. One is for the Sharon Yamato's film, which unfortunately, because I'm not in the area, I'm not going to be able to see. I think it's going to be premiered at Janum or shown at Janum. But the session is next Wednesday, 25th. Yeah, 25th at yeah. Thank you very much for putting that in the chat. And then the other one I want to also make mention as well is because, as you could tell in this particular presentation, Tule Lake comes into play. And the Tule Lake pilgrimage will be happening next year. It happens over the 4th of July weekend or somewhere there, that weekend of 4th of July. The day for registration on that is still in the planning phases. I don't know what the details are, but in years past, it's always been registration always starts on February 19th. And the registration gets filled very quickly. So if you're interested at all at attending the Tule Lake pilgrimage, keep an eye out for that. Watch the website. TuleLake.org is, I believe, what it is the website.
Yeah, I just put that in the chat. It is. It's kind of like getting concert tickets. You gotta, you gotta be ready for it to come out. That's for sure. That's right. So James, you went through the training to be a docent, right? And I heard that was really incredible.
Yeah, it was from the folks that were on the presentation, our fellow docents, the one on about Tule Lake that happened. When was that? Was that Sunday? I guess it was this past Sunday.
Yes, I'll see if I can get the link.
Diana and Tomiko. At any rate, yeah, they're fellow docents. It was a very good one. Tule Lake has a very troubled history. You can feel it there. It's definitely, you can definitely feel it. But the pilgrimage has always been a good one. It's where I learned about a whole lot of this stuff. It was a very good experience, very educational.
We can send the link out in the follow-up email too, to that session as well.
Great.
Oh, there, Kimiko just did it. She just
okay.
put it in the chat. Thanks.
Okay. I guess, any other questions?
Well, thank you all so much for coming. And thank you, James, for putting this presentation together and sharing with us and having a recording.
Yeah, and my thanks as well to you, Julie, and to Kimiko, and to everybody who bothered to take the time. Thanks very much, Mike. And again, thanks very much for making this part of your day today.
Thank you so much. And when is, Kimiko, when is that presentation with Sharon Yamato? It's coming up next week.
It is. I will put the link in the chat.
I was looking for it. I couldn't find it. Sorry.
Yeah, it's right here.
Great.
There you go.
Okay, there we go.
Yep,
Thank you all.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And is the Yonsei event happening right now, Kimiko?
Yeah, it actually started at like a half an hour ago, so it's still going though.
Okay, so if you want to join that, thank you all, and stay tuned to Dadaima. Thank you so much. Thank you, James.
Thank you. Bye-bye.